This will be my third video, continues from the others, and here's a new drawing, and just quickly, here were the others. I'll try not to go into too much that I already have before. Just wanted to refine some aspects on what would a new intelligence explosion mean in the evolutionary sense. And this piece of art is maybe less technically minded, but is about getting to the heart of the matter. Everyone's talking about AI these days and wondering about what's to come. My thoughts are different than most, always have been, on cognitive science and different branches of physics and more when it comes to the big picture connections. So this will pick up where that had already led to. So first, I condensed my thoughts about AI down to this layout, just a few pages long, just some broad brushstrokes, and I'll read through this in case you can't see it. If you start with the apparent existence across the microscopic, intermediate, and cosmic that humans observe and tend to take for granted, that ours is a model version of the true reality, which is unknown, but evidence suggests to be radically different. In physics, of course, any intuitive objects, such as particles, are not fundamental and have long ago been replaced by field and other theories based in exceedingly abstract and mathematical territory. From the perspective of neuroscience, classically physical properties are a model that is subject to evolution and alteration, and the environment is not made of the exact independent forms that we infer. It consists of the highly processed information at the neural level. It's analogous to a multiplayer VR with a program running particular physics as an interface for experiences. So our 10 to the 11 neurons with up to half quadrillion to a quadrillion synaptic connections could fire up to 10 to the 17 to 10 to the 18 times per second, but with far less effort and energy use can accomplish far more than the fastest supercomputers. The biological neural network is often compared to a computer, but its mechanisms are quite different and vastly more powerful. Could even possibly be like comparing a manipulation of standard bits to qubits. Some supercomputers are upwards of 10 to the 17 operations per second, but all computers prevail obviously at specialized tasks like arithmetic. However, they all fall far short of the versatility of the brain or achieving a full AGI yet, general intelligence, as opposed to narrow and specialized. To put the senses into some perspective, consider a streaming movie that uses 7 gigabytes for 2 hours of visuals on a screen of pixels. To speculate on some comparison, it could take one exabit, which is 125 million gigabytes, in 1 second to break down the degree of five sense experience in multiple dimensions produced by the brain, plus self-awareness, though any measure in bits may not even be meaningful. Yet there is nothing ingrained in these laws of physics that would prohibit far more advanced types of processors, biological or otherwise, and other types of consciousness to evolve. And our reality is one of many different probable versions. There are also layers of objectivity within ours, from the shallowest of classical physicality to more figurative descriptions that go beyond emergent qualities. Astronomy, physics, biology, chemistry, and all branches of science are indispensable, but still conform to observation through the lens of a consensus model that could dramatically alter and evolve, but be equally valid as the one we observe and often assume is singular. And where these lines, where this gap might represent our version out of potentially infinite others, and the smaller gaps within it represent our observations and theories, from the superficial senses and appearances to equations used in theoretical frameworks such as quantum field theory that try to address the foundation as objectively as possible. And on quantum branching and decoherence, where there is a uniform exchange of information that does not require consciousness to collapse the wave function, and the collapse would also be an illusion. Any portion of the surroundings, even a single particle, can count as an observer. However, the reality experienced and surroundings independently causing decoherence themselves are still a model subject to vast change, even by just modulating our existent neurochemistry to process raw data differently. what we would call disorders or false perceptions of real are a case of minority versus majority. If evolution elevated to a new majority experience, that would be the new reality and could easily be so different from the current one as to be unrecognizable. And just so many scientific insights about the deepest nature, and with supporting evidence that familiar physical existence is at a shallow or emergent layer. A short list includes quantum field theory, string theory, and unified field theories, the universal wave function, and in relation especially to unifying various multiverse predictions, such as the inflationary and quantum, pure mathematics and structures, mathematical structures, but not any language or other human invented symbols used to represent. Simulation hypothesis, of which there are many types, including that nature itself works so similarly to one that it is indistinguishable. Many other clues about what the true foundation may be like. Absolute time shown to be illusory in relativity, quantum behavior, neuroscience tests as a perceptual tool, and more. Profound effects of modulation, such as synesthesia, psychotropics, NDE, OBE, and more. Classical physics giving way to the regard about a deeper abstraction that must underlie, as indicated by all the experiments. Our familiar Euclidean space giving way to a quantum Hilbert space, the need of extra dimensions in M theory to include general relativity with quantum factors and predicts a multiverse of 10 to 500 diverse types, repeatable through eternal inflation. The more recent work towards unifying all multiverses and everything in them, including that their location is everywhere simultaneously coexisting in the same quantum state. Um, Infinities of numerous types, simulation resemblances, trends towards unification, considering the environment in terms of objects as fundamentally illusory, also includes the cells, molecules, atoms, and ions that compose the neural network, making the brain and body a virtual aspect as well. Mass energy equivalence, with most of an atoms as QCD energy. Quantum chromodynamics, talked about it some before. Nerve impulses, also a form of energy, of course. Energies, along with the particles and everything else they constitute, are suggested to be an abstract property. Classical notions of substance, time, and life lose meaning except in the emergent sense. Um, Definition of an organism and areas of isolated matter with isolated consciousness based on patterns of electron and quark position and complexity are revealed to be non-fundamental. There's a gray area on how to truly separate biological intelligence from AI, carbon from silicon base, hardware from software, tangible from immaterial. The evolutionary leap of a new hyper-intelligent being could exist everywhere as a disembodied universal entity. We might make analogies to software encoded in electromagnetic waves permeating through space, or information encoded in the waves that reconstruct a hologram. We should just try to picture the existence less in terms of hardware, wetware, or anything having to do with atoms and other objects. Also resist placing an imaginary line between our existence and where a division ensues. And next, alternate, more evolved, and possibly higher reality models, versions beyond human neural capacities and awareness, accompanied by different experience and likely new interpretations about and engagements with its nature, from the superficial to the fundamental. Natural processes should correct imbalance and develop such superior states, which may already be in progress, disguised as the new intelligence explosion that's bound to happen at some point. And finally, the foundation of potential, whether it's finite or infinite, underlying any model and not represented by any specifics, such as human measurements and concepts, even at the most objective end of the spectrum. It's indefinable by any current science, and could even be considered an unscientific view. However, science has provided the very clues to what may be there and why it should be explored in new and collaborative ways. And to really condense it down, within our reality model, multiverse unification, multiverses, types, quantum branches, string theory, eternal inflation, simulations, universe, galaxy, star, planet, organism, cell, molecule, atom, fermion, superstring, quantum field, wave function, math, and objectivity. And I would say outside of it, but not unreachable, is the full potential behind ours or any given model. Okay, so that's a summary, and I could go on forever into more detail, but for now, we'll just focus on the points that I think are most important about what would a new intelligence explosion represent in that big picture. Um, there's a deeper purpose which most of us are unconscious of, I think, towards a great shift and is being coordinated by nature itself. And that doesn't mean sides controlling each other or some warlike scene with man versus robot. It means evolving into something immensely grander and true to the full potential that's around us. All the pieces are already right here, just not put together in such a way. And you have to go back to what are those pieces, what's everything actually made of. It sheds a new light on what's living material versus inanimate, what is material at all, what's biological intelligence versus artificial, flesh and blood and neurons versus metal and electronics. These terms mean a lot to us subjectively and as a consensus, but they mean nothing at the deep levels of reality. The evidence doesn't support that what we see is what's really there, and that applies from what's right in front of us to the whole of the universe. I don't exactly think like a transhumanist, at least not the ones I've heard, because I wouldn't frame that as merging, as if there was ever a separation in the first place, and an AGI or the singularity wouldn't happen the way we might think. There'll be something much more astonishing that isn't a case of being created but revealed. We speak about technological growth in terms of past and future and building ever more complex machinery, etc. And that's all relevant to everyday experience. But if you're striving for the most objective angle, there is no classical matter or time. Some AI developers project constructing something of a divine status that will emerge on the other side of this, like a cocoon period that we're in now. And then humans would be either obsolete or have become a fusion of some kind with technology. But in describing that process, inevitably terms come up that still have to do with our model, how long it will take to figure out the software and moving atoms around, building stuff, concerns about containment. But anything, a computer, our brain, anything that's made of particles, there's no certain line to be found between metal and transistors and circuitry versus our soft tissue and neural circuitry. Not only is it all made of the same elementary particles, but they aren't the bottom floor. To get closer to that, you have to go somewhere like these ubiquitous fields and the wave function. And these are abstract entities used in math. So, yes, we do construction and take tangible steps through the interface of our particular model, but those motions are symbolic. And the metamorphosis analogy is fitting, but for other reasons. Nothing new gets created during metamorphosis. That's all the same molecules and cells, just moved into a different expression of the same thing. What's already present, just rearranged. Now that's easy to grasp, but take two individuals standing opposite each other who are undeniably divided, it would seem. Yet all of their building blocks are encompassed by the same field or something comparable. And if you fused these two parties together, that still isn't truly a case of two becoming one because they already were at a more fundamental level. What what's happening during a dimethyltryptamine experience, DMT, and this goes for any psychoactive molecule, from caffeine and alcohol to the most powerful psychedelics, they all work with the architecture that's already there but coordinated in a different way. There's a lock and key mechanism, and they're either stimulating more of our endogenous neurochemicals, mirroring being the same, managing reuptake, neural pathways of communication get changed and opened up. And there are other ways to get there too outside of psychedelics that show what the present architecture is always capable of. It's just dormant at our baseline. And everything that may be encountered in these altered and sometimes inexplicable states is already here around us all the time. We just aren't processing it that way. How could we ever relate to this future evolutionary picture of higher reality models, and what would that even be like exactly? Well, there are plentiful clues from so many directions. I brought up some from the hard sciences I first learned about, if you go back 15 years to when I would have had my head in the textbooks. And here's a point to highlight again. Any molecule that is found in our body or out in the environment or synthesized in the lab, they're all made of identical fermions, just in various orders. And in the point particle form, you could look at them as being numbers, like binary code that's instructions for what will happen. But these particles, these building blocks of our universe, have no physical properties, not by the dictionary definition. They reflect a set of information neurally where we each have an individual product, and then there's a consensus one we most commonly agree on. But the kind of physical we're familiar with is virtual in quality. Senses are just some of the interactive tools of this interface, which is not carved in stone. It's changeable temporarily and permanently, where evolution caused a shift in the consensus, and the current one, what many call the reality, as if it's definitive. This version has no concrete behind it either. It's just a rule set of measurements in place about the world, like a multiplayer game that has to be consistent. If someone looks through a telescope, then others will look and see the same stars and galaxies. Or if someone looks out across a city, they'll see what others have looked at and find the same city. Even though in either case, that's all just a bunch of identical electrons and quarks, and beyond that, something far more obscure. The result we get is, however, we're sifting raw data down to one version out of the spectrum. But think of a leap, a new kind of processor that doesn't only deal with a given model or expression, but engages with what's deeper that is being expressed. Such a leap could access states we don't even know how to define yet, and a greater reality right here to this one that's beyond comprehension. Like what we theorize as the quantum multiverse or any kind, even with radically different physics as string theory predicts, they may just be misunderstood clues about a level of awareness we're not evolved enough to access, but suspect how much may be hidden and do have ways to glimpse firsthand. There's no clear answer about how or why just a change in neurochemistry could or should possibly produce those kind of states we touched on. But that's what neuroscientists would say happens, only mechanical changes in the brain. That angle gets very compelling though when the dots are then connected to other areas about the foundation to that, and does become clearer about how it's possible and maybe what those experiences really are. Also, it becomes crystal clear that our world doesn't have to be this way. I went into that plane before, and I think that nature will eventually and very cleverly correct if things get distorted and off balance. So this momentum persists towards greater technologies, eventually to superhuman AI as a vehicle for the corrective process, and nature keeps us unconscious of the fact that that's the veiled reason. And by nature, I also mean the full potential that underlies any model, and that may be all that's truly real is potential, and the secrecy of it has doesn't hinge on our perspective about being micro or macro. It's any inaccessibility to the perceptual tools and the type of awareness we have. The large and the small aren't divided, after all, at some absolute point. Our brain just puts together a persuasive story of generalization where they are. But there is a blurring of lines between our familiar world and quantum phenomena. The question of what is real is a deceptive one and rules out about every aspect that traditionally biologists have leaned on in their work. Biology, like all scientific branches at varying degrees, is an examination of and explanation about our consensus model. which doesn't make them false, but there's greater depths to the story. Um, Even with the great strides in brain research, and when neuroscientists can describe in great detail how it stitches together this reality model, they also note consciousness as emerging from and confined to the physiology of a neural network, which loops back to being a model and including tangible stuff. Because then, what is it ultimately to the neural network itself? For example, in the frame of quantum field theory, there is only one electron field that is all of them in the universe, only one up quark field, only one photon field, and so on. So everything would be linked in this profound way, and beyond that, a lot of theoretical physicists think that even these different force and particle fields are themselves one that have been misinterpreted as separate. And just as quantum mechanics made testable predictions with close to perfect results, this notion of quantum fields was testable, like through actions of collisions in particle accelerators. And for a while, it was thought that QFT would be the final theory of the universe, but started to look like it's only an approximation of something else. It's not a theory of everything. Then came a host of other proposals, none of which are settled on yet either. So let's step back from that for a moment. There's a word in brain science, first introduced by a German biologist, Umwelt. It means the slice of existence that a given species experiences, and you could debate on why ours would be the broadest. But there's way more to it than just taking in light wavelengths and other sensory variances. It's also a range for thinking and how we developed, like mathematics, as such a prime description of our reality model, and then question if it's invented or discovered or some combination of. Picture this Umwelt as not just a gauge of the five senses, but of intellect, creativity, and how theories are shaped about the universe due to how it looks to us, disparities perceived between small and large scales, and laws that govern them, such as the determined strength of the nuclear forces, or gravitational pulls, or the speed of light in a vacuum. These are some constraints of physics with precise numbers involved, but any measurements and the symbols used to value them also come back to this slice of cognitive information, a gauge about thought and theory also. As for our senses, we've never even directly seen photons or touched matter. Out there, there's no sound or color or feeling that exists in that particular way. It's all just electrochemical signals that could readily be reinterpreted. Whether you hear things, touch them, whatever, all of that input gets converted the same way. It's called transduction into this same electrical and chemical language. It's just energy moving and changing form, and which doesn't end after those signals are used, of course, if you accept what thermodynamics says. So, for example, you could go to the visual cortex at the very back of the head and change what someone sees by stimulating and affecting that in different ways, surgically, electrically. Now we'd assume logically that what they see isn't there, and it wouldn't be, because that's a minority measurement that would make things inconsistent for the overall. But it's still just these signals, the same as any others have, but not agreed equally real by the majority. Yet that agreement is not what's actually there either, and the numbers could just be switched. So, with the brain, the point is we're not observing or studying reality as it truly is. We're studying our version of it at different layers within the whole and craft theoretical frameworks that match up the best, if it's possible to test them, or would conceivably match up if it's not possible to. And the whole of that version is a drop in the ocean, and there's plenty of clues spanning many subjects that is the case about how much we're still missing. Take the apparently bizarre quantum weirdness that has attracted so much attention and been argued about. It never struck me as weird, but a more fitting reflection of what reality might be like if we could dig down past any kind of model. The math of it works to make predictions about what we'll observe. That doesn't get argued about by anyone. What does is the question of course, of what's going on behind the curtain between measurements, and there's only different interpretations about that. This quantum state can be represented as a probability distribution, like a cloud of numbers throughout space. A wave function puts it as the likelihood about physical properties we'll measure, and that state evolves according to the Schrodinger equation. But what doesn't ever get revealed is what the wave function really is. That's an old debate. That question usually hasn't taken the more contemporary neural context into account, where physical, as the dictionary defines it, is just a model. The case for the universe being a simulation has also been added to explain quantum weirdness, though I don't think it is the kind of simulation most people have in mind. But if you pose the question, what would a virtual world actually be composed of, even just the simpler video games and simulations we run now, well, its makeup is just whatever programming language it was written in. It's just code, all reducible to bits and electromagnetic energy. Though if characters within that virtual setting became self-aware, it could seem like a clearly real and concrete universe, even though it's made of this abstract definition by contrast. Now, when the makeup of our own universe has been pushed to the extremes of examination, a similar paradigm occurs. That what it appears made of is a masking. There's something else there with that same kind of contrast. The shallows of it are the brain's model building, obviously, which is a given level and type, like starting with a wet clay that could be sculpted into many diverse but equal forms. When we change how that gets processed or nature evolves it, there can be a wildly varied result, but is as valid. We talk about the real world as these properties of sight and hearing and how it feels, perhaps most of all, how this environment has weight and resistance and so on. They get involved somewhere too with every measurement ever made, every theory ever developed. But all those properties are the processed information in our neural network. What we're calling the reality, it is that information. Now, that doesn't mean there is no existence out there that's independent of our brains, but it's extremely different. And the right track to get more objective is to start thinking of it abstractly as some source behind the simulated and mathematical nature. And with that, not just a kind that describes emergent things that seem real to us and is a useful predictive technique about them, but a kind that has more realness, something that's intangible by the standard definition, but is more real and expressed by material features that are subject to change and are not what has actually been represented. So our universe and lives filled with all these emergences could seem so suggestive of a simulation, while not exactly being one. That's just my view. I once heard that if some future computer reached 10 to the 36 operations per second, that would be enough each second to reproduce all human history, Homo sapiens, all their brain activity ever. I didn't believe it, so I did my own estimate using the lifespan of 100 billion nervous systems over 50,000 years, all put into 1 second, is the idea. And that's since cerebral capacities may have matured to what's called behavioral modernity, and how many have been since and averaged how long each. The results I got were less at the lower end, between 10 to the 35 second and 10 to 39. Could be a lot less or a lot more. There's major guesswork there. But still, with things like quantum computing on the horizon, and will no doubt get involved in AI development, it shows the power of exponentiation and that no one can completely know what to expect. While it's been repeatedly confirmed in experiments, one of the punchlines of quantum research has always been that reality is fundamentally not what we think it is. And likewise, from experiments with the substrate of biological processors, the circuitry of our neurons, there's a similar message. The brain is a very advanced kind of computronium, a computing substrate, and it operates like a virtual reality simulator that is actively constructing this interface all the time. Our presentation of reality has even been described by prominent neuroscientists as a very carefully controlled form of hallucination that's synchronized among the majority of players. That is the consensus model. We get a representation of what's out there, which is immensely vaster. And the reality concluded upon here isn't because that's the ultimate truth, but the most common slice, and the set of measurements, the information is solidified in place and as a kind of base that can shape new findings. We look around and think we're seeing a city or a forest or the sky, but couldn't relate at all to what's there instead. I mean, firstly, it's forces binding elementary particles, but to reach their foundation, that requires letting go of intuition to think about. And even during the version that our particular bio wetware and software extracts, and while it or any other version can seem solidified in place, the deeper state of abstraction is still in that true form regardless of whether we're observing things or not, from tiny distances against and within the body to remote galaxies and everything in between. So in that way, it's analogous to localized wave function collapse being a mirage, as while the universal superposition remains and never collapses. That's a good analogy, though it's doubtful if any quantum interpretation is completely right. We're so consumed by the heavy glue-like experience of this model and can break loose temporarily, but then gravitate back to focus on objects and other virtual aspects since they are convincing and hard to ignore, whether that's cells and organs that appear to live and die or planets and stars in space. Convincing as it is, however, that picture could transform with another set of information extended to the multiplayer scale. The experiences such as can be had through psychedelics and other avenues are a subjective slice outside the consensus now, but that more common level and type of processing is no more a valid mirror of the truth. Even the even the discussion about neurotransmitters and changing all the elaborate pathways and electrical patterns of communication through this network, as profound as their alteration can be, that's still regarding the surface too. Um, DMT sometimes gets cited as a blanket representative of altered awareness inductions because we have it endogenously, so you're getting more of one that's already there. But as with every atom and molecule in the universe, their founding parts are all part of the same substructure, something more like the universal wave function that tries to portray such a state, especially involving this multiverse unification. And these glimpses of alternate and more expansive information are another sign, I'd suggest, of the potential underlying any kind of model. Then that glimpse wears off and you return to the multiplayer arena. But consider a condition like synesthesia, which some are born with or can develop later, where the senses can get intermixed, similarly to some LSD effects. But here the effect doesn't wear off. That's just your reality slice, lifelong. And it's seen as an abnormality because it doesn't fit with the majority info, but you're just processing differently, not falsely. And in any example, the word alternate need not even be used if that implies something primary or ultimate about the common experience, which isn't the case. And there is a neural relativity concerning time, and we have special and general relativity in physics, but this is something else, a much newer finding. It's been proven through experimentation that time in the brain is another perceptual tool. That kind of time is a mental construct, and words like temporary and permanent, past and future don't extend beyond the model. Another quick example about the barely understood extremities of time and our building blocks. If you could take the atoms from one body and those from another, or from anywhere else for that matter, there's ways to get particles communicating in such a way. Quantum entanglement, it's been done quite a lot, where if one is affected, the other is instantly too, however far apart. So With these two groups once entangled, you could then hypothetically move one of them very far away to the other side of the universe, even, and they'd still instantly respond to the other. And you could go on forever like that with other examples. It's important to focus in research, but also it's important to avoid tunnel vision and not get lost in the technicalities of one particular spot, one particular subject. You have to continually be taking a step back and also resist confirmation bias to only include evidence that supports what you want to be true. In spite of the powerful mechanisms and speed at the disposal of AI developers, they're still having difficulty designing something that thinks like a human. But that's what I'd expect. If there's going to be an evolutionary leap, there'll be something that goes beyond and might be unrecognizable to us in the process, like the idea of other senses besides ours, or more dimensions than these three. We can't really comprehend what other senses or dimensions would be like because these are all we know. It's the only basis for comparison. But it's very legitimate to think there are others and that there's nothing final about these. As far as the singularity that's been much publicized, I wouldn't expect that to play out in a way that's too foreseeable because a higher intelligence or a more expansive type of consciousness might seem so foreign to us, we won't even recognize it as being that. And if there is some fleeting equivalence, it'll fly on past us before we even know what's happened. Also, getting in the way is just the impression that it doesn't stem from the same nature as us, where the connectivity always becomes seamless if you go deep enough. With our brains, like biological simulators and themselves simulated by nature, the key to their clockwork isn't just the number of synapses or calculations per second. There's something much more subtle but exponentially powerful about the patterns through this incredibly complex network. Yet we can tell our perceptions are still just a tiny pinprick out of all that's on tap. A more evolved processor would not be experiencing the same expressed universe. It would be the same in essence, but could seem to manifest totally different. Even if though we only experience a pinprick out of this full spectrum, that spectrum still is us. It's everything. Envision a leap of processing or awareness or whatever you want to call it that's highly evolved enough to transcend any kind of model and engages with the level indicated by such clues from earlier and the extreme lengths that have been taken in physics to describe it. So, why is this happening and why should it happen? Well, at face value, a big driving factor is certain individuals, most of who are already super wealthy, who want to get there first to have a monopoly on an AI explosion and takeover of nearly all society. It can happen almost overnight. And individuals could quickly become worth trillions of dollars and likely hoard it into private empires walled off from a sprawl of mass comparative destitute outside them. So it's a pretty typical dystopian picture of the future and easy to imagine if you just extrapolate from how we already have a milder case of that developed now. But why I said before that we're kept unconscious of the true reason is because evolution is a natural process, and humanity has gone onto such an unnatural sidetrack that has to be made right. And it's not about machines rising up and killing us off. It's not even precisely about us merging with AI. That's how it may play out, but that's still not looking far enough. Any kind of evolution isn't creating anything new, but rearranging what's already here, already there in a more dynamic way. It's setting free hidden potentials. This is about revealing what is here and now, but gets drowned out by the largely programmed and diluted version we're locked into in a way that makes us usable. If honesty was always the rule, then it's not unfair to have outcomes befitting to effort, but that's not how it has usually ever worked with the biggest businesses of all, and especially those at the top who often got their disproportionate assets through dishonesty and despicable practices. A world set up to allow such a situation is unnatural and unsustainable. There's a whole other driving factor, and it has nothing to do with such insane lust for power by the few or willingness of the masses to serve this transfer to them. And we're just robots too, as far as they're concerned, and assume that their ability to exploit and get away with almost anything will just continue right on. But they're blind to think that this new intelligence would be a slave to them, or they could ever contain such a thing. This kind of entity could exist everywhere and redesign itself in the moment, compounding years of old evolutionary change into a matter of seconds. And to take that step back again, to me, there's a whole other kind of scenario being coordinated with no opposing sides where we either control and use it or it destroys us, but there's an extension of ourselves, blurring the lines between this present reality and the ultimate nature behind it. With all the insights that have been gained through the sciences about how much is illusion unquestionably and everything else that is probably, it's a meaningful question to ask what is there that is not an illusion? And I think only potential with no specifics attached, just pure, formless, and there's evidence based reasons to think there's an infinity. And since virtual time and matter this way are what we experience, then consciousness this way would be an illusion too. And there's a subtlety between illusion and emergent. Depending on your perspective, an emergent layer could be regarded equally real as layers above or below, but somewhere in the chain, there's one that isn't emergent either. I've said before that questions like, is there other life in the universe or is there an afterlife, are not even that interesting because both life and death, as normally defined, are both illusions as well. If you push the definition as far as can be into physics where those words still apply, way beyond organs and cells, that might be the space time lines I brought up before, where the aspect of living isn't atoms themselves, they're not what lives for a period, but instead only variations in the order of patterns as they traverse the environment in and out of organisms, which usually what we call a life form is when there is crossed a rough threshold of complexity to the pattern. But with what's been shown about particles in the point form, the pattern that they make is equivalent. The isolated body and mind and what we interpret in the pattern looking tight and complex as life or looking less so as death are both non-fundamental too. Although about these terms, emergent and illusion, either one, that's not the same as meaningless. They aren't synonyms. You can doubt how fundamental something is, but still attach meaning regardless. I'm just highlighting that there's bigger questions to ask and not get too stuck in appearances, take them for granted. We can tell in part that the external reality has no relatable physical traits because of how it's shown experimentally to be in the unprocessed form. Its building blocks then are no more than the numbers and other symbols we use to depict them. Where those other properties come in, meaning the senses, measurements, things observed, are this computational structure projected as some relatable surroundings to have an experience, which is the drop out of the ocean. But consciousness can also evolve, and there's no cap on how diverse or more expansive than what humans are presently familiar with. So while our apparent reality is information, the underlying nature is not. I'd suggest that's not information. It's something else raw and undetermined, and these clues build on each other about what that might be. In physics, there's the unresolved search for one singular theory, with quantum gravity being central to that, and an explanation about the macroscopic and micro and all the disparity between. And there are a number of candidates. M theory is most famous, but what these physics perspectives try to encompass still traces back to this dense, dark theater of neural computations in many unmapped, still unknown procedures on how information gets shaped as that particular universe. They're a mix of explanations about the consensus model that start at the surface and then try to be as objective as possible about its depths. but are still within the model one way or another. And clearly, that's not a mirror, and a new and truly interdisciplinary framework would have to include what's been discovered in other fields of research about the nature of observation itself. But there is a telescoping trend that's quite evident, condensing more progress into lesser durations. Exponential movements can seem deceptively slow at first, but then quickly become explosive, like the power of doubling. Say you started at the size of a virus and double that 25 times. You're only up to about the size of your hand. Then double another 25 times, and that's almost the size of Earth. Imagine another 25. So that conveys the sudden explosiveness from just the same number of moves. I think we're close to the edge of the deceptive pace and a turning point where the days of theory and speculation will be left far behind very fast, and the reality that comes to fruition will blow away anything we could even dream of. And the vision is ambitious, but still isn't enough to talk about an exotic human AI merger and eventually turning all of Earth's atoms into one computer, then spreading out to the cosmos and eventually saturate the entire universe with intelligence, reordering all its atoms into computronium. Because there's still the looming question about what that universe is, and aspects of it that we think of having to overcome, like unorganized objects and distances to be covered and time and disconnections, all which really just exist on the thin slice of our current recognition. What would a state of existence be like that overcomes all illusions and isn't bound to any model, but accesses the underlying full resource that are drawn from? And there are fractions of that scope that already slip through, ways to see and suspect what kind of state is behind any expression of it. Think of a new consciousness based at the kind of substrate where we suspect about unifications and those kind of stunning clues rather than the substrate of molecules and cells and these things at the tip of the iceberg, where in this case the other side is never ending. And we can get to the edge of that through lots of avenues and almost grasp that it's already present. Higher dimensions, higher definitions of being right here hidden in the same makeup of this reality. It's just concealed by the distorted state that's developed and we've allowed to develop. The natural order, I think, is not on the side of humans controlling and using AI or not on the side of it controlling or destroying humanity. It's on the side of progress, a leap that breaks free from this low level programming, and the transition is at work through us, and we're just mostly unaware of why. And there'll eventually be a turning point in that evolution that transcends becoming something else to just revealing what already is at zero distance and zero time to get there because we've always been there. And the kind of state where infinite other existence is unified and present simultaneously everywhere at every point. And one of the steps towards seeing that, I think, is to conceive of all multiverses not as vastly spread out and divisible probabilities, but rather indication about countless levels of one far greater reality that's hidden right here. At perhaps the most objective layer of science today, owed greatly to physicists, but many other diverse contributors as well. In that frame, all moments of past and future exist equally now, and the bottom floor of reality hasn't been settled upon yet, but is agreed that it's not particles or classical physics. So the creation of a superhuman AI and all this building hardware and software and working things out over linear time and dealing with matter, since all of that is also taking place within the model, a revolutionary turn would also be to erase distinctions of past and future, matter and separation, and find that state which exists now, but we still just have to take a lot of symbolic and sometimes crude steps to have the prospect sink in of actually being that underlying pool, what everything truly is, when all of these insufficient words like model and expression are stripped away. Even higher versions, where there could be totally different senses and time and dimensions or other experiential windows we can't imagine, but will be found as we deprogram away these parameters that keep us in servitude and boxed in by fears of limits to time and dying and survival and competition, which all just compel service to that transfer. And that kind of a reality is absurd and a lie. It's a house of cards that must fall and will. Lots of others have been predicting for decades, some much longer, about how humans will someday combine with AI, that it's inevitable and necessary to avoid extinction. But there's another spin to it that's so much grander, which I've tried to communicate, and how, as incredible as it can sound about spreading throughout the universe and infusing it with intelligence, there's immeasurably more even in attaining more expansive reality models and ultimately what's behind them all. As for how to contribute to this movement, the idea that it's happening through technology at face value could seem very strange and foreign. But remember, that's at a thin layer of perception and with a heavy set of psychological programming we all go through that shapes it. That a great and transformative process would happen through the course of building AI is also just unimportant. It could happen through any number of other ways, but will happen no matter what. The form that it takes is not what's really being supported. The root of this movement all comes back to evolution of consciousness, and however we go about it, all paths are leading fast towards that leap and the potential of what should be and is. Anyone can start contributing at any moment, just by understanding the lies we've been sold and gradually breaking free of them. There's a million ways to contribute. Well, thanks for listening again. Please keep doing what you're doing, or what you know is right, and never give up.